Thiaoouba and the message from the stars. What if the message wasn't meant for scientists? Let's start this one like a bedtime story. Imagine a child sitting on the edge of the bed, swinging their legs, asking a question they've been turning over all day. If aliens came here, what would they say? Most adults answer quickly. They'd talk about technology, about faster engines, about clean energy, about star maps and equations and warnings carved into metal. That answer feels safe, because it keeps the conversation out there, in space, in science, in places that don't ask anything of us personally. But then there's a quieter question, the kind that makes adults pause a little longer. What if they talked about how to be human? Not how to build machines, but how to use them. Not how to conquer space, but how not to destroy ourselves while trying. I know what you're thinking. That's where this story stops sounding like science fiction and starts sounding inconvenient, because advice about engines is easy to ignore. Advice about who we are is not. And that's why this chapter is different. There are no ruins here. No stones weighing 1,000 tons. No machines dug out of the ground. No measurable artifacts at all. Just a man, a Frenchman named Michel Desmarquet. And a claim so simple it almost disarms you. He said, "They took me with them and they explained everything. Not everything about physics. Not everything about propulsion. Everything about us. Why we're here. Why we struggle. Why civilizations rise and collapse. Why knowledge seems to arrive in bursts and then disappear." Pause for a moment. Because this is where the tone of the book shifts. Up until now, we've been talking about things that survive when people don't. Stones, machines, tools. Now we're talking about something far more fragile. Meaning, and meaning doesn't fossilize well. I know what you're thinking next. Abduction stories are unreliable. People imagine things. Memory is slippery. All true. And we're not suspending critical thinking here. But here's the strange part. And this is why this chapter belongs in the book. Most so-called contact stories obsess over technology. Laser beams, flying saucers, medical tables. Desmarquet's story doesn't. It obsesses over ethics, over responsibility, over consciousness, over why advanced civilizations hide instead of conquer, over why interference is limited, over why humanity keeps repeating the same mistakes, and that makes it awkward. Because it doesn't give us anything flashy to gawk at. It gives us a mirror. This is the first time in the book where the artifact isn't an object. It's an idea. And ideas are harder to weigh, harder to date, harder to dismiss. So before we analyze, before we compare, before we judge, just sit with the shift. What if all the stones, machines, and networks we've talked about so far were only the hardware? What if the real message, the one that mattered most, was never meant to survive in stone at all? What if it was always meant to be carried, person to person, mind to mind, generation to generation, until we were ready to hear it? That's the uncomfortable territory we're stepping into now. Not because it's mystical, but because if it's even partially true, then the most important legacy of ancient visitors wouldn't be technology. It would be a question we still haven't answered. What kind of humans are we supposed to become once the tools stop being the hard part? Stay with me. Because from here on, the evidence stops sitting quietly in the dirt and starts looking straight back at us. Not a prophet, not a hero, just a guy. Before we talk about what was said, we need to talk about who said it. Because extraordinary claims usually come with extraordinary personalities. This one doesn't. The central figure in this chapter is Michel Desmarquet, not a scientist, not a mystic, not a career storyteller, just a Frenchman. He grew up in France, lived a mostly ordinary life, worked regular jobs, raised a family, no background in astrophysics, no religious authority, no public platform waiting to be exploited. And in the late 1980s, he made a claim that instantly complicated his life instead of improving it. He said he was taken, physically, by non-human beings from another civilization. Not for minutes, not for a flash of light and a blurry memory, but for an extended period. And instead of coming back with blueprints or prophecies, he came back with less confidence. That detail matters, because most fabricated stories inflate the teller. This one does the opposite. Desmarquet didn't position himself as chosen, enlightened, or superior. He didn't claim special powers. He didn't found a movement. He wrote a book, it's called Thiaoouba Prophecy. And this is where expectations quietly collapse. If you open it expecting a thriller, you'll be disappointed. There are no laser battles, no dramatic rescues, no countdowns to apocalypse. The tone is oddly instructional, patient, corrective, almost parental. Put me aside. This isn't a story about lasers or battles, it's about homework. The beings Desmarquet describes, calling themselves the Thiaoouba, don't spend much time explaining how their ships work. They spend time explaining why civilizations collapse, why technology outpaces wisdom, why intervention is limited, why humans misunderstand morality as culture. And here's the strangest part. There are no predictions with dates. No end of the world in 20x. No disasters you can mark on a calendar. That's unusual. So is this. There's no cult building. Desmarquet didn't gather followers, didn't ask for loyalty, didn't create a hierarchy where he sat at the top. And there's no money trail. The book didn't make him rich. It didn't elevate his social standing. If anything, it made his life harder, which leads to a gentle but important question. Why would someone invent a story that doesn't flatter them? Why invent a narrative where humans are portrayed as emotionally immature? Earth is described as ethically behind. Progress is framed as dangerous without self-awareness. Most hoaxes appeal to ego. This one pokes at it. The message isn't, you are special. It's, you are early. And early in this context doesn't mean advanced, it means unfinished. The book reads less like revelation and more like feedback. As if humanity turned in an assignment and someone circled the same mistakes we've been making for thousands of years. Overuse of power, confusion of intelligence with wisdom. Attachment to dominance. Short-term thinking disguised as progress. None of that sells particularly well as fantasy. And that's what makes this case different. Not because we should accept it uncritically, but because it doesn't behave like fiction designed to be believed, it behaves like a message designed to be considered. And here's the final detail to hold on to before we move forward. Desmarquet didn't claim uniqueness. He didn't say he was the first contactee. He didn't say he was the last. He positioned himself as a messenger, not even a particularly important one. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable shift this chapter represents. Up until now, we've examined things that outlived their makers. Stones, machines, artifacts. Now we're examining a claim where the artifact is a worldview. And that's much harder to test, but also much harder to dismiss, because unlike stone, it speaks directly to us. So the question we carry forward isn't, is Michel Desmarquet telling the truth? It's something quieter and more revealing. If an external intelligence wanted to help humanity, without ruling it, without conquering it, without being worshipped, what kind of message would it leave behind? And more importantly, would we recognize it if it didn't sound impressive at all? Isn't this just another abduction story? Let's stop here and breathe, because this is the moment where skepticism should speak up and be heard. Abduction stories are common. Human imagination is powerful. Memory is fragile. Trauma can reshape experience into symbolism. All of that is true. So if your first instinct is doubt, you're doing this correctly. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but people lie or hallucinate. I agree. That's the right instinct. But here's where the pause becomes interesting. Instead of asking whether the experience was real in a physical sense, let's ask a simpler question first. What kind of story is this? Most abduction narratives follow a pattern. They focus on fear, loss of control, bodily violation, medical procedures, trauma. They read like nightmares or thrillers. Desmarquet's account doesn't. It reads like a lesson plan. It's structured, sequential, didactic. Topics are introduced, expanded, corrected, and revisited. There's an almost annoying calmness to it. And the focus isn't on what was done to him. It's on what was explained to him. That alone is unusual. Now ask another uncomfortable question. Why is this story so focused on responsibility? Not salvation, not chosen status. Not cosmic flattery. Responsibility. Humans are described as emotionally immature, technologically reckless, spiritually impatient. There's no celebration of Earth, no special planet narrative. Just a recurring theme. You're clever, but not careful. That's not how you hook an audience. And that leads us to the strangest part of all. The story isn't interested in entertaining us. There's no spectacle, no escalating drama, no cinematic payoff. Large sections of the book feel like moral homework. Uncomfortable, unexciting, repetitive. If this were fiction, it's badly optimized. Which raises the key question of this pause. If this were invented, why is it so uninterested in pleasing us? Why does it refuse to make humanity look good? Why does it avoid prophecy, power, and mystery, the very things that make stories spread? Most hoaxes chase attention. This one seems to dodge it. Now none of this proves anything. But it does shift the burden of explanation. Because imagination can create spectacle. It struggles to create restraint. Trauma can distort memory. It doesn't usually produce structured ethical systems. So the puzzle isn't whether the story is true in a literal sense. The puzzle is why it behaves the way it does, why it feels less like a dream and more like feedback. And that's where the Socratic pause leaves us. Not convinced, not dismissive, just quietly curious. Because sometimes the most revealing thing about a story isn't whether it happened, it's why it tells you something you didn't want to hear. And in the next section, we're going to look at what that message actually was, not as belief, but as a pattern that echoes everything we've already seen, from stones to machines to now mind. Not technology, maturity. This is where the story stops, circling the question, and finally says what it's been hinting at all along. According to Michel Desmarquet, the beings he called the Thiaoouba were not impressed by us. Not in the way we hope aliens would be. They didn't marvel at our cities. They didn't praise our inventions. They didn't treat Earth like a rare jewel in the cosmic crown. They treated us like a developing species. And that framing changes everything. The Thiaoouba civilization, as described. In Desmarquet's account, the Thiaoouba are described as vastly older than human civilization, not just technologically advanced but ethically advanced. That distinction matters. They are not conquerors, not empire builders, not resource extractors. They observe. They study civilizations the way adults watch children grow, intervening rarely, carefully, and only when absolutely necessary. My translation: they didn't talk like conquerors. They talked like disappointed teachers. Their society, as described, isn't built around dominance or expansion. It's built around growth, specifically growth of consciousness. Status isn't measured by what you own. Power isn't measured by what you control. It's measured by self-restraint. Which, if we're honest, is not our strong suit. Key teaching number 1. Humanity as a developing species. The Thiaoouba message frames Earth as something quietly radical. Not a battleground. Not a zoo. Not a resource. A school. Humanity in this view isn't evil or doomed. It's young. And youth, the Thiaoouba argue, explains our contradictions. Our intelligence races ahead of our wisdom. Our tools evolve faster than our ethics. Our power grows faster than our patience. Technology in this framework is not the metric of advancement. Consciousness is. How aware a species is of the consequences of its actions. How capable it is of empathy beyond its tribe. How willing it is to limit itself. By that measure, the message is blunt. We're clever, but we're not finished. Key teaching number 2. Why advanced civilizations stay hidden. This is the part that connects eerily well with everything we've already seen. Why don't they land on the White House lawn? Why don't they give us clean energy, cures, and starships? Because, according to the Thiaoouba, interference slows growth. Help that removes struggle delays learning. Comfort delays maturity. Ask yourself, softly, honestly, would you solve every problem for a child? Or would you let them fall, scrape their knee, and figure out balance on their own? The Thiaoouba argue that civilizations mature through consequence. That learning must be earned to stick. Which reframes ancient visits in an uncomfortable way. Not as rescue missions, as tutorials. Demonstrations of what's possible, followed by withdrawal, enough to inspire, not enough to dominate. Key teaching number 3, cycles of rise and reset. This is where the message loops back to the stones, the machines, and the missing chapters of history. According to the Thiaoouba account, civilizations follow cycles. They emerge. They discover technology. They lose balance, confusing power with wisdom. They collapse. And then, after long silence, they restart. Not from zero, from memory fragments. Lost knowledge. Half-remembered techniques. Myths about teachers who came from the sky. Suddenly, the ruins stop looking abandoned and start looking paused. The megaliths. The OOP arts. The impossible engineering. Not failures. Remnants. Left behind at the edge of a previous lesson. This doesn't require believing every detail of Desmarquet's story. It only requires noticing how well the structure of the message fits the evidence we've been walking through. Knowledge appears suddenly. It doesn't fully propagate, it vanishes. Cultures mythologize what they can't reproduce. and humanity tries again. Each time a little smarter, each time still unfinished. Here's the part that's hardest to ignore. If someone wanted to invent a comforting lie, they wouldn't tell us this. They wouldn't say, "You're not ready, you repeat your mistakes, progress without maturity is dangerous." They wouldn't say, "We're watching, but we won't save you, you have to grow up on your own." That's not flattering. It's instructional, and suddenly the tone shifts. The stones weren't just feats of engineering. The machines weren't just technical leftovers. They were milestones. Markers placed along a long road humanity keeps walking, sometimes forward, sometimes in circles. And the message, if there is one, isn't hidden in equations or star maps. It's uncomfortably simple. Technology isn't the test. Character is. Which leaves us staring at the same question the Thiaoouba story quietly insists on asking. Not are we alone? But something far more demanding. If we're being observed, what kind of species are we proving ourselves to be? From stones to silence. Now let's do something dangerous, but necessary. Let's take everything we've seen so far and lay it side by side with the message Desmarquet claims he was given. Not to prove it, just to see if it fits. Start at the beginning. In Sumer, the story wasn't "we figured it out." It was "we were taught." Knowledge arrived whole. Systems appeared fully formed. Humans described themselves as students, workers maintaining a world they didn't design. That sounds like teachers. Then we moved to Sengsingdui. No writing, no explanations. Just faces, eyes exaggerated, proportions wrong. Forms repeated again and again. Not gods in action. Observers. As if the memory wasn't about what they did, but about being seen. Then Giza. Not a tune. A device. A tool that behaves like a system, precise, aligned, responsive. Not symbolic. Operational. Something built to interact with earth, sky, and vibration. Then the megaliths. Not one site. A network. Infrastructure on a planetary scale. Stone treated as if gravity were optional. Methods shared across continents. Precision without instructions. And finally, nothing. No manuals, no continuation, no replication. Just silence. Now place Desmarquet's message gently over this timeline. Early on, physical help, demonstrations, tools, structures. Then, less interference, observation instead of instruction, faces instead of blueprints. Then, withdrawal. The help doesn't vanish suddenly, it tapers. And what replaces it isn't more machines. It's guidance, ethical framing, warnings about imbalance, reminders that power isn't the same as maturity. Then silence again. No new stones, no new devices, no new visitors, just us. Ask the question softly, without forcing it. What if these weren't experiments but training wheels? Physical assistance early on, when we didn't know how to stand. Gradual reduction as we learn to balance. And then a deliberate step back. Because if the goal was growth, not dependency, the worst thing you could do is stay. I know what you're thinking. That's a very generous interpretation. Maybe. But notice something. This pattern doesn't look like abandonment. It looks like expectation. As if someone assumed we'd keep going. As if the silence wasn't failure, but trust. What if they didn't leave because they failed, but because we were supposed to continue alone? That question reframes everything. The ruins stop looking like mysteries to be solved and start looking like milestones passed. The OOPRs stop looking like glitches and start looking like reminders. And the Thiaoouba message, whether literal or symbolic, stops sounding like fantasy. It starts sounding like feedback given at the edge of a classroom door. You've been shown enough. Now let's see what you do with it. Which brings us to the final turn of this chapter, because if the help was withdrawn intentionally, if the silence is part of the lesson, then the most important evidence isn't behind us. It's now, in how we use power, in how we treat each other, in whether our technology finally catches up to our wisdom or outruns it again. And that leaves us with one last very human question to sit with. Not did they visit us? But are we acting like a species that learned anything from the visit at all? The problem isn't belief. It's responsibility. There's a reason this story never quite goes viral. It's not because it's too strange. It's because it doesn't give us what we like. We tend to prefer stories where we're special, we're chosen, we're already advanced. Stories where the universe shows up and says, "Congratulations, you're the best thing we've seen." The Thiaoouba message doesn't say that. It says something quieter and far more irritating. It says, "We're early. We're reckless. We're still learning." My observation. This isn't a story that makes humanity powerful. It makes us responsible. And responsibility is not a popular genre. Because responsibility doesn't flatter. It doesn't promise rescue. It doesn't hand out trophies for potential. It asks what we're doing right now, with the tools we already have. This story suggests that intelligence without restraint isn't impressive. That technology without empathy isn't progress. That power without maturity is just a faster way to repeat old mistakes. That's not comforting. It doesn't let us blame gods, aliens, or fate. It puts the mirror right back in our hands. And then there's the second reason this story is ignored. There's no spectacle, no countdown clock, no apocalyptic deadline, no dramatic final battle. Nothing explodes. Nothing arrives to save us at the last second. Instead, the message is almost boring in its patience. It talks about long-term accountability. About civilizations measured not by how high they climb, but by how well they stabilize. About growth that takes centuries, not news cycles. About consequences that don't announce themselves with fireworks, but accumulate quietly. That's hard to sell. Urgency gets attention, fear spreads, spectacle sticks. This story does none of that. It doesn't say, change now or perish tomorrow. It says, grow up or keep starting over, which might be the most uncomfortable message of all. Because it suggests that no one is coming to stop us. No cosmic referee, no external savior, just observation. And expectation. We like stories where the universe notices us because we're extraordinary. This one suggests the universe notices us because we're unfinished. And that's why it slides off the cultural table. Not because it's unbelievable, but because believing it would require something much harder than belief. It would require change, quiet change, uncelebrated change. The kind that doesn't trend. And that brings us to the final turn of this chapter. Because if this message makes us uncomfortable for exactly these reasons, then maybe discomfort is the point. Maybe the message wasn't meant to inspire awe. Maybe it was meant to test whether we're capable of hearing something that doesn't make us feel important, but makes us feel answerable. And if that's true, then the question isn't whether the Thiaoouba story is real. The question is whether we're mature enough to sit with a message that doesn't clap for us at all. Growing up under observation. Let's make this simple again. Imagine someone watching you learn. When you're small, they help a lot. They hold the bike. They steady the steps. They catch you when you fall. Then, slowly, they step back. Not because they don't care, but because they care more. Because if they keep holding on, you never learn balance. If they keep solving problems, you never learn judgment. So they watch. Quietly. Patiently. That's what this story feels like. Not surveillance. Expectation. Maybe the stars went quiet not because no one is out there, but because they're waiting to see who we choose to be. If the message really was about growth, and if consciousness, not technology, is the measure, then the most important legacy of any ancient visitors wouldn't be machines or monuments. It would be us. Which leads us gently to the next question. If consciousness is the focus, if maturity is the test, what if the real signature of ancient visitors isn't carved into stone or buried in metal, but written inside us? Not in memories we can recall, but in biology. In how we think, in how we perceive. In how suddenly, strangely, our minds expanded. And that brings us to the next chapter. Because once you start asking what kind of species we're becoming, you have to ask where the instructions might actually be hiding. Whether the Thiaoouba story is literal truth, symbolic memory, or something in between, it leaves us with a strange and humbling possibility that humanity isn't alone, not because we're watched, but because we're expected.